you can change the world without taking power is one of the most bankrupt, foolish, and stupid slogans I have heard in a long time. You cannot change the world without taking power.
Very pleased to have you here, and we are of course interested to know your opinion about or your analysis of the war on Iraq, and why do you think it was necessary for the Bush administration to accelerate the aggressions towards Middle East and especially Iraq? And there has been a lot of motives. They've been talking about a lot of motives, but the real necessity for them to do it, what do you think about that?
Well, there was no necessity for the United States to intervene and invade Iraq. No necessity at all. If they wanted the oil, they had access to it. They had done deals with Saddam Hussein before when he was an ally. They had bought Iraqi oil even during the sanctions period using third parties, including oil companies and from Panama. So it was not a problem. But I think the key way to understand what happened in Iraq is to understand that under the Bush regime, after he was elected, even before 9/11, we now know, they were determined to display imperial power. They were determined to show the world, we are the largest, most powerful nation in the world, and we can do what we want. We don't have any enemies, we don't have any countervailing forces since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we will do it. And I think that was the principal reason. It was a display of imperial power. There were secondary reasons which flow from that. One, their closest ally in the Middle East is, of course, Israel. And the Israeli Likud regime was extremely keen that Iraq was crushed because they felt that the Iraqi army was the only army in the region with the potential to deal with Israel, and the Iraqi regime was giving a lot of money and weapons to the Palestinians. So that was a side reason, if you like. But the third reason was also to show their potential rivals, the Far East, China, Korea, Japan, that we control the oil. We are the imperial power. We will not stop it. We will not stop you getting the oil, but we control it. So if you need it, you have to do what we want. You have to be friends with us. Don't try to be too independent.
You published a book last year called Bush in Babylon, which told the history of Iraq as a country and the political history. I would like you to comment on that and what kind of a country and resistance that the occupation forces are facing.
Well, in my book, Bush in Babylon, The Recolonization of Iraq, I provided a history of this country, a history of resistance against the British Empire, a history of resistance against the puppets placed into power by the British Empire, explained the history of the Iraqi Communist Party, a party whose first leaders were very brave and courageous and were hanged by the British in public. People forget this. But a party which also made many mistakes. And it's to explain how they have made now another big mistake by collaborating with the United States. The Iraqi Communist Party has now become, and many people call it the Iraqi Collaborators Party. They are part and parcel of the puppet administration. And you have to see that together with all these former communists in Eastern European countries, former communists who are now capitalists, who joined the expedition to Iraq. You have Bulgarian, Romanian, Polish, Ukrainian troops in Iraq. Now, even as we talk, yesterday, the good news from the Ukraine was that the Ukrainian parliament voted to withdraw all troops from Iraq. But why were they there in the first place? There has been more support for the United States from Europe now than there was during the Vietnam War. And we have to register that. So this is the world in which we live. Now, the resistance in Iraq exists on two levels. It's a military resistance carried out by people who work on their own, self-autonomous, decentralized, working in different parts, who took arms and hid them before the United States came because they knew it would be a long, protracted war. Then you have a political resistance which is led by religious parties, Shia parties, some of them close to Iran. These parties, basically inspired by Ayatollah Sistani and Muqtada al-Sadr, have decided, as we speak, they might change their minds in 2 weeks' time, they have decided to participate in the January elections. And that has created a rift with the military resistance, who are saying no elections while we are occupied. You cannot have a free election when you have 150,000 American and 50,000 British soldiers in our country. Let them go and then we will have an election. But the Shia parties are saying, no, we will win this election and then drive them out. There's no difference in the overall aim to get rid of the occupation and to reassert Iraqi control over Iraqi oil. On this, everyone is agreed. But there are now different tactics opening up, which I think is unfortunate. I have been arguing that in order to win support abroad, we needed the creation of a national Iraqi Liberation Front, a political and military organization. But they have not been able to do this, and that is a weakness, in my opinion, in what is happening.
That leads me to another question about the intellectuals and the left in United States, Europe and other places, that before the war there was a split. Some parts supported the war because they felt it was anyhow important to get rid of a tyrant, whilst we had this very massive demonstrations and movement against the war. And then after the victory, so-called victory, the protest movement, the anti-war movement sort of imploded, and we got this discussion now among intellectuals and also in the left if we should support or not the resistance, and based on hesitations to support an Islamic resistant Islamic movement.
First, let's discuss the anti-war movement. This was the largest, most spontaneous anti-imperial, anti-war movement we have seen in the history of the world. Not just in Europe, but in North America. Every American city had big demonstrations. 1 million people, or just under 1 million people, marched in New York, the city where the explosions took place. And I think we have to be careful how we analyze this. This was not a demonstrations organized exclusively by the left. These were demonstrations which had millions of people who had never participated in political activity on the streets before. And they came, ordinary, concerned citizens, because they did not believe the lies their politicians were telling them. They just instinctively rejected the lies of their political leaders. they thought, many of them thought, they, by coming out in such large numbers, 1.5 million in London, 3 million in Rome, 2 million in Spain, they thought they could stop the war. And when the war went ahead, in any case, a large part of this public opinion felt they had lost because they are not experienced politically. And that feeling that they had failed and lost drove them back into their homes to wait and see what happens. So none of them were prepared for a resistance. But the resistance is now taking place. But we live in a world which is very different from the 70s and 60s and 80s of the last century. We live in a world where many people's ideas are formed not by material realities of power, but by Amnesty International. And this creates a feeling that people do not like violence, and I'm sympathetic to that. But when you have an ugly occupation in Iraq, you cannot have a beautiful resistance.
But we have this very contradictory situation also, that some of the governments in Europe that was firmly against the war are now accepting the situation and accepting the Iraq government. But on the other hand, some of the new so-called new European governments that sent troops to Iraq are withdrawing them. Of course, also Spain with the change of government, but that's a special case, I think. But that the Ukrainian government or parliament decided yesterday to take home the troops, and others are also sort of thinking twice about having troops there.
That's because of the Iraqi resistance. You know, it's fine to send troops if you think they don't have to fight. But when you think you have to fight and kill people or be killed yourself, then it becomes a completely difficult, a different problem. But the European governments, I think, if there had been no Iraqi resistance, the French and the Germans would have been back in bed with the United States very openly. They already decided to vote for the United Nations resolutions recognizing the puppet government. They are desperate to make friends again, and I think we can't totally rely on these people because their interests are those which coincide with those of the United States. They are not going to make a break. They try constantly to clamber back. The Spanish are an exception, and one reason is the mass mobilizations in Spain that took place against the war. People then forgot, and the bombs reminded them of what their government had done. Aznar had gone to war without the support of his people, and the people, reminded by a horrific incident of what they had thought, threw him out. And I think the Zapatero government in Spain, in my opinion, is the best government we have in Europe at the moment. Zapatero promised, soon after I am elected, I will withdraw the troops. People were not sure because people don't trust politicians. He withdrew the troops. He went in public, his foreign minister, and denounced what the Spanish embassy had done in Venezuela in collaborating with the US embassy to try and organize a coup d'etat against Hugo Chavez. Excellent. Zapatero then went further, and his government tried to open discussions with the Cubans and tried to create an atmosphere in which the EU sanctions on Cuba would be stopped. So on three questions, Iraq, the most important, Venezuela and Cuba, the Zapatero government has made a shift. And I think this is very interesting. For me, this is the most interesting development in Europe today. Because if the Spanish begin to play this role, it's very important for Latin America, but it's also important for Europe.
I think so too, and I'm also concerned that he might stay rather alone because even well, one social democratic government participated and still participates in the war, the British government, and then there you don't have any alternative there to change the government and change the participation in the war.
But the British government, you have to understand, is a special case. This is a country which, let us be honest, is a medium-sized Northern European country. The only way it's different from the rest of Europe is it has a large army, which is a hangover from its old imperial past and its old imperial status. But this country, under Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher, and now Tony Blair, who is her successor in every way, has decided that their place in the world lies in the arms of the United States. They will not break with it, and there's a material reason for that, because the British, or sections of the British elite, and this particular group around Blair, they feel that if they did not accept what the Americans demanded of them each time, the Americans would dump them and try and do a direct deal with the Germans, and that would leave the British with nothing in Europe. But I always say to them when I debate and argue with them, it is better to be like that than be how you are. And you know, one should not underestimate British public opinion. I think Blair will be punished. He might not lose, but his majority might be severely reduced in the next elections. And a majority of people in Britain now, for the first time, 56% of the British are in favor of withdrawing troops from Iraq. That's a very important figure, which means that they cannot maintain their troop presence indefinitely. And even in the United States, the opinion polls are not in favor of the war. They vary, but they are not totally in favor. So I think that despite Bush's re-election and Blair still being in power, the situation in Iraq will be determined by what happens in Iraq. And they will be looking for ways to pull out.
But I would like to talk a little about Latin America, as you mentioned it, and we have in Latin America there are very strong United States regime has their plans and constant aggressions and threats towards Latin America with Cuba and Venezuela in the firing line, but also the social movements the social and political movements that are growing in Latin America in a way that we don't see in other parts of the world. So even though those governments collaborated with the United States in Haiti, they have also a project trying to reassert certain independence, and they have a popular support, and you have a sort of new situation with Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Cuba, and now Uruguay also. It's complex, but what do you think about this and the importance of the Latin American political and social movement in the world and the balance in the world?
Quiero que me devuelvan la libertad.
Si no es con muerte, ¿cómo lo van a poder parar si no es con represión?
I have been arguing now for some years that Latin America is the most advanced laboratory to observe the effects of neoliberal economics and the offensive of the financial institutions. It's without any doubt. Latin America is always the country which the United States experiments with first, whether it's economics or politics, military dictatorships. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, totally backed by the United States, which killed tens of thousands of people. At that time, no one used to speak about human rights because it was not convenient. So they have used this continent as their own backyard, and they say it quite openly. So after the end of the Cold War, a new situation arose. What would they do? And you see, for me, I see imperial politics not as economics alone. It's economics, politics, and military. And the monster, the neoliberal monster, walks on two legs. One is economic, and the other is military to reinforce the economics. Politics today, if you like, has become concentrated economics. And in this situation, Latin America is very important, which is why you have the strongest social movements in Latin America as well. Look, but we have to make a differentiation here. The Cuban Revolution in 1959, 1960 changed the picture in Latin America. They were not able to crush the Cuban Revolution. They tried during the Bay of Pigs. They made many attempts to assassinate Fidel. They failed. The Cuban Revolution, it went through good periods, bad periods, difficult periods, but it survived. And that survival is very important for the consciousness of the whole of Latin America. Why? Because the whole world, not only in Latin America, the whole world knows that this tiny little island called Cuba, off the shores of the United States, has improved the lives of its people. It has educated its people. It has not let them starve. It has provided a health system which is today amongst the best in the world. And it tries to help other people, not by sending armed gangs, but by sending its doctors. Cuban doctors today are understood and admired all over the world. And this is extremely important for the whole of Latin America. So when Venezuela happened and the Bolivarian Revolution began to take place, the fact that Cuba existed was extremely important for it. As Chavez says very openly.
Hoy comienza de nuevo otra batalla más dentro de la lucha del pueblo venezolano para recuperar su dignidad, para levantar de nuevo su bandera y para construir una nueva patria.
The victory of Chavez, the defeat of all imperial attempts so far to topple Chavez have been extremely important for rebuilding consciousness in Latin America. But Venezuela and Cuba are exceptional. You have seen the election of Lula in Brazil, of new governments in Uruguay, of Kirchner in Argentina. Kirchner is again different, but Kirchner comes to power in Argentina after a massive collapse of the country. For 15 years, Argentinian governments, whoever was the president, did everything. The IMF, the World Bank, and the US Treasury Department asked them to do. They did it, and then they collapsed. And within 2 weeks, we had 3 presidents, and you had social movements. The problem was that the social movements in Argentina could not develop a political alternative. That's a big weakness. And then Kirchner came, but even now he is telling the IMF and the World Bank, no, I won't do it. No, I won't restructure the debt. No, I will not do it the way you want me to do it. And the reason for that is because what happened before in Argentina. And I think the Latin American laboratory is now producing interesting things. Big social movements against water privatization in Bolivia. Big social movements against electricity privatization in Peru. Big referendum which defeats privatization in Uruguay, which makes it difficult for the new government to privatize. So these are very interesting developments, the most advanced in the world, much more important than anything that's going on in Asia, Africa, or Europe, is happening in Latin America today. So we have to learn. But I think my own feeling is that the United States is making these threats against Cuba to try and put pressure on the Cuban regime and the Cuban people to change course, allow the market back, then we can talk, etc., etc., etc. But I don't think it's going to work. And my own feeling is that it is unlikely that they will carry out a military invasion of Cuba. One reason they will not even think about it is because, unlike the Iraqi army, which was very demoralized and weak, Even in Iraq, with a demoralized and weak army, they faced a big resistance. For them to invade Cuba would be a slap in the face of the whole of Latin America. And there would be a resistance in Cuba. They would not get away with it unless they decide to destroy the whole island. So I'm not sure they will do it. I think they are playing politics. They are playing politics. They need to do a few things. And they are also trying to frighten countries like Venezuela or Uruguay or Argentina. This is what we can do. We are here. Don't think we have gone away. And this is what makes it necessary. You see, the United States are very strong. They are very powerful. We know that. They can't be defeated militarily, but they can be resisted. And this resistance will become strong if you had a situation in Latin America, let's say a utopian but not an impossible situation, a Bolivarian federation. A Bolivarian federation which has Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay would be very strong. It wouldn't be weak. It would be strong. And Venezuela has the oil to help the federation. But the United States prefers to deal always with countries bilaterally.
We are here in Venezuela in this international conference of intellectuals and artists in defense of humanity. And we have been talking about the dangers of humanity. What do you think are the most important and urgent tasks for the intellectuals and artists?
Well, I think the most important thing intellectuals and artists have to do is to be engaged, is not to retreat into their own world. Because the pressure of the world in which we live is to retreat. If you're an intellectual, if you're a professor, if you're an artist, if you're an actor, you can earn usually enough money to live comfortably. And that material comfort and a consumerist world often makes life quite pleasant for people. So why should we be worried about what is happening in Venezuela when we can go and, have a nice meal in a beautiful town in Tuscany? That's what life is about. Who cares? And that's something which the campaign against the Iraq war changed amongst the young. And one thing that is extremely important, I think, both to learn from this conference and others, that the laws of biology are the most powerful laws in the world. People grow older and older and they die. So the most important thing is to create and help to bring a new generation of young people into the politics of engagement, resistance, doubt, skepticism, to understand the world in which they live. That's our main task today, those of us who come from an older generation.